Welcome, Excellencies, parliamentarians, and guests. We are honored that you are with us today to hear insights on global trade, danger ahead, with Dr. Ann Penner. As global trade is a complex issue that impacts all of us, we are grateful that Dr. Penner will give us perspective in the time available. We also have the privilege of hearing the Honourable Ed Fast, official opposition Shadow Minister of Finance and former Minister of International Trade, who will give concluding comments. My name is Darlene McLean. My Christian Embassy colleagues and I are happy to offer this event. The Christian Embassy of Canada is one of 10 Christian embassies around the world that exist to connect and facilitate trusted relationships with parliamentary, diplomatic, and professional leaders. Whether it's through value-added presentations like this one, personal interactions, or other initiatives, we seek to inspire leaders with the person and the values of Jesus. Today, we anticipate having diplomatic leaders from more than 30 countries, parliamentarians from all across Canada, and professional leaders from a variety of sectors with us. We're delighted that business leader Mr. Terry Wills will be verbalizing your questions to Dr. Penner. Mr. Wills is president of Wills Transfer Limited, a third-party logistics firm in Eastern Ontario. The company provides transportation, inventory management, and distribution solutions to governments and the private sector. Wills Transfer has been recognized as one of Canada's best managed companies. They are a fourth-generation family business, and so we congratulate them on their recent celebration of 75 years of business. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ann Penner. With a PhD in Canadian and comparative politics, Dr. Penner served 10 years in the Multilateral Trade Policy Division of Agriculture Canada before beginning her own consulting firm. She served more than 5 years with the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. Currently, she provides advice on trade policy, trade negotiations, and trade law through her firm, 3 Point Perspectives. And concurrently, she teaches upper-level courses in law, public policy, and international trade at 2 Canadian universities. She's a devoted daughter, wife, and mother, a remarkable woman, as you will soon hear for yourselves. Dr. Penner, we are eager to hear from you.
It is just a real pleasure to be with all of you today. The Christian Embassy has been a really good and supportive friend to me and my family for many years. And so it is something that definitely we value, we support, we pray for. My dad, John Reimer, who is joining the call from Gravenhurst, Ontario, was an MP back in the late 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s. My husband, Dave Penner, was a political staffer in pretty much every capacity you could imagine for 18 years on the Hill. And both of them during their time really valued the support they received, the prayers they received, the friendships they made. And so that, it just means a lot to be with you today. Dave and I actually, and our 2 boys, Mark and Andrew, who are also on this call, as a family, we had the privilege of welcoming a Colombian ambassador and his children and his wife into our home one evening for dinner. And we just built a wonderful relationship with them. And so that was a real privilege too. Growing up in a home with a dad, an MP, and a husband who was a staffer, and then someone who was a public servant myself, I have a profound respect for those who give their lives to public service, be it in the diplomatic corps, on the Hill, and then those who pray and support them. So it's just an honor to be with you today. As you know, our topic is global trade danger ahead. Now that is a huge and complicated topic to try and tackle in 15 minutes. And certainly I can, just barely touch the surface. And I'm going to do my best. Just to set the context and just to give you a little sense of where I see some of the problems are and what some of the potential solutions are. My interest in trade goes way back to when I was a teenager. Again, Dad was an MP running in the 1988 free trade election. And so free trade with the United States became a dinner table conversation. And it really sparked my interest and dictated a lot of what I studied, both in my undergraduate education and then most importantly in my graduate during my MA and PhD studies. I really got interested in how international trade disputes could be resolved within free trade agreements like we had with the US, the NAFTA then, and then also in the WTO context. And from there, that got me into a professional world of trade as a trade policy analyst, part of a trade negotiating team, and then as a trade adjudicator on the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, or CITT, which is a quasi-judicial institution that decides and adjudicates a number of different types of trade disputes. So that's me, that's my perspective. And so let's just jump right in. So let's start by setting the context for some of you who aren't quite as familiar with our topic as others. And to do that, we need to go back some 80, 90 years. It was the Great Depression and the aftermath of World War II that motivated countries to build global institutions that would try to rebuild the world out of the wake of those two huge and catastrophic events. These institutions were there to promote global peace, security, and economic stability. One of those institutions was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. And the GATT was built on the premise that rules-based trade would benefit all countries, irrespective of their political power or their economic development. All members of the GATT would enjoy certain trading rights, provided they also respected their trading responsibilities or their obligations by working side by side within the global trading system to bring down barriers to facilitate the flow of goods and services around the world. So liberalization became the watchword. It became the buzzword. It became the foundation for trade policies and also for businesses. This is how they could start to rebuild, and this is how they could compete. Over time, the GATT's trade rules and obligations intensified, they developed, culminating in the creation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 1995. Now, around this same time, especially through the 80s and into 90s, countries, including Canada, were building a whole web of bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade agreements. And there I've listed just a few of the key ones from a Canadian perspective: our trade agreement with the US, the NAFTA context, with Europe, known as the CETA, and with Asia, called the CPTPP for short. Those are just to name a few. Those agreements helped countries address increasingly complicated and politically charged trade issues alongside the WTO. That would be agriculture, trade remedies, e-commerce, intellectual property, biotechnology. As those kinds of new things exploded, trade agreements had to adjust, all within a rules-based forum. At the foundation of every trade agreement was the knowledge that there was a dispute settlement mechanism to resolve disputes fairly, impartially, more quickly, notwithstanding the relative economic or political power of the countries involved. And so, in short, liberalization was encouraging countries to work together to promote collective interests, global security, and economic prosperity. For certain, that was not perfect. It can't be perfect. And yet there was this commitment to advance those issues on a global scale. For many years, the trading system worked because countries held a common purpose, a common vision, and a common resolve. They trusted the institutions they had created. Businesses became more and more familiar with them, and knew how those frameworks could help to advance their well-being. And so countries agreed that these institutions could not only serve their national interests, but international interests as well. And that resolve started to weaken in and around the early 2000s. Rise of populism, for example, the financial crisis of 2008, countries began to lose faith in these institutions, in these rules that they had created. And at the same time as weakening of trust was going down, protectionist sentiments were on the rise. Protectionist sentiments were starting to overtake the centrality of liberalization, the commitment of liberalization in their economic and trade policy frameworks. And in some cases, this happened overtly and abruptly, and we read about those all the time. In other cases, that started to happen subtly, almost imperceptibly, as other policy objectives started to creep in some cases contradicting the importance of trade. And the result was and is the same. The global trading system is being put into danger, liberalization is being compromised, and there are real strains on vital supply chains. So what are some of the overt and abrupt examples? Well, we saw the US over a certain number of years block institutional reform at the WTO by refusing to appoint a new director to head the organization and new members to its appellate body to resolve disputes. We saw China block imports of Canadian canola on false and arbitrary grounds. We saw the UK pull out of the EU, which really impacted that common market. We saw the US put tariffs on steel and aluminum imports under the guise of national security. The subtle examples, those are a little bit more complicated. They're a little bit more difficult to see. And on the face, they don't always appear quite as concerning. Most of them are done under other policy objectives, socioeconomic objectives, environmental objectives, legitimate as though they may be. And yet, some of those policies are in effect acting as tariffs. They are putting walls up to the free flow of goods and services around the world. Let me give you just one very small example. Consider the issue of buy local. It's something that we hear about all the time. It's certainly a good policy in and of itself. It certainly has its merits, especially in the sense of where we are in our COVID context, as countless small and local businesses are being forced to the brink. And yet, buy local has puts real contradictions, puts real issues in place from a trade perspective. Many countries, including Canada, gear their trade policies to reducing trade deficits by increasing export volumes relative to import volumes. But at the same time, governments are increasingly urging consumers to buy local. Well, that's a contradiction. As we ship goods out, we're still asking people to buy within. And buy local can have real significant impacts for vital regional, continental, and global supply chains. And as such, it has real significant impacts for businesses, big and small, who rely on those supply chains for their necessary inputs or their production processes. And it has significant implications for consumers who count on supply chains for a diverse range of affordable goods in the marketplace. Just think of yourself going to the grocery store, what you buy. Not all of that is produced locally. Some of it is, most of it cannot be. Think of what you wear. Look around your home. When I teach my students, when I teach my kids about the value of trade, I just think of what you're wearing, think of what you like to do. Those goods are made elsewhere, and we need to bring them in as we exchange our goods for them. Taken to the extreme, buy local can actually fuel large-scale protectionist policies like Buy America. Now, Buy America is not new. It's a policy that's been in place for many years. It's raised its head at various different times and taken different forms. But the most recent form, what we're seeing, is incredibly dangerous from a supply chain liberalization point of view. In its current form, Buy America threatens to exclude Canadian businesses from hundreds of millions of dollars worth of American infrastructure projects, even though many Canadians have supplied those goods and services for many years, even though they've done it incredibly successfully, given the long-standing and productive relationships that they have with American manufacturers, American producers, American governments. And notwithstanding the fact that Canadian suppliers provide real value for US taxpayers, because our goods, Canadian goods, are often cheaper than their American counterparts. But that wall is going up. It is protectionism, and it is preventing the free flow of goods and services. So now what? So what do we do? Is the global system beyond repair? Is it truly in danger? Well, the answer is no. No, in that trade agreements don't trade. Businesses trade. And so producers and businesses all over the world, including in Canada, have the necessary legal frameworks in place they need to succeed, given the number of agreements that have been put in place over the past few decades. No, in the sense that countries are starting to talk about the kind of issues facing the WTO, and this is including the new Biden administration. And hopefully that will start to get some of those discussions about reforming the appellate body, institutional change back on track. No, in the sense that Canada, from a Buy America point of view, we have faced that before, and we've been able to successfully deal with it, given the strong government to government, business to business, and people to people relationships between Canadians and Americans. And as you'll read in the news, as many of you know, significant efforts are underway at many different levels to ensure that the US understands the implications that this has, not only just from a Canadian perspective, but from an American perspective as well. And hopefully that will help to secure the waivers that Canadian businesses need, just like they were able to do, for example, back in 2010. But, and this is a big but, the global trading system will be in real danger should all countries, Canada included, not remember why they committed to trade liberalization in the first place. And as they start to pursue policies that actually contradict liberalization and have the effect of undermining it. So how can we ensure that countries do this? How can we ensure that countries remember why this was created in the first place? How can we assure that countries reaffirm the importance of working together within trade institutions for the sake of their collective security and prosperity? Because evidence does confirm that trade agreements work, but they only work when their members are fully committed to their provisions, when they cede some of their own interests, their own sovereignty for the sake of others. And obviously that can't happen when governments and businesses pursue their own interests at the expense of everyone else's. So I realize encouraging countries to work together, to reaffirm the importance of institutions, I know that sounds a lot like a politician's talking point or an academic's thesis. I realize that. And you can say it's overly simplistic, but can it really happen? Yes, I do believe it can. But it means that we have to drill down deeper than just looking for solutions on a country-to-country basis. So what do I mean by that? Well, when I was at the CITT, when I was a trade adjudicator, I learned very quickly that all trade disputes, no matter how big, no matter how valuable, they all began when an individual business or an individual producer ran into difficulties because of the manner in which trade rules were either negotiated or implemented at the border. And so the way that I would typically characterize that, or the way that I teach my students that, is I say all trade disputes, no matter how big, no matter how complicated, all trade disputes start at home with individuals in their daily lives. And so I would suggest that for a couple of moments, we consider global trading problems at the level of an individual. Because just as the problems facing global trade are caused by protectionism, when countries pursue their own interests at the expense of anyone else's, so too are the problems that we as individuals face when we pursue our own self-interests, when we only focus on what is mine. And the solution is humility. I truly believe the most important quality for any leader, especially today, is humility. Because humility allows us to look at what others need and how we can help them meet those needs. Without humility, security, peace, and trust fall to the wayside as faith in relationships and institutions erodes. And this happens on personal levels, business, political, diplomatic relationships. Last weekend, Christians celebrated Easter, and Easter operationalizes humility. It shows us how the humility of the Lord Jesus Christ can save us from a problem more dangerous than anything that could possibly impact global trade. And that problem is sin. Easter reminds us how Jesus humbled himself by putting aside his own interests to die on a Roman cross for you and for me. In humility, he sacrificed himself for my sins and yours. He created, in effect, the greatest trade agreement that we could ever conceive. By extending forgiveness, he allows us to trade eternal death and complete separation from a loving and holy God for abundant peace and everlasting security and life. The Bible assures us that to receive this gift of forgiveness, all we need to do is ask and acknowledge by faith that Jesus died on the cross for our sins. And when we do that, the Bible promises that we will be at peace with God, given a new peace-filled, secure way of living and thinking for this life and the next. Now, taking such a step requires humility, because we have to confront and confess the ugly reality that we are all sinful, full of selfish ambition and pride. But if and as we do this, we will be transformed. We will be changed. And we will be able to see that everything, who we are, what we have, what we do, individually and professionally, everything belongs to him. And everything is about him and how we can thank him for what he did for us. Consider what Abraham Kuyper, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, once said. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Jesus Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry mine. And if we accept this truth with humility, we will be able to practically address the problems facing our world, one by one by one, including global trade, for those of you who are involved in that sphere. A humble mindset will help us recognize that we have to cede some of our own sovereignty for a bigger purpose. It will enable us to start putting the interests of others on par with or even ahead of our own, on a personal, commercial, political, and dare I say it, international level too. It'll allow us to honor our commitments instead of just insisting on our rights, to serve not just our friends, but our opponents, to listen to others and show them respect, even if and as we disagree, and think of what our world could look like. And so I sincerely submit to you that the most basic yet most profound answer to our global trading problems is humility. Let me leave you with this. Konrad Adenauer was the Chancellor of West Germany just after World War II. And he once asked Billy Graham, what is the most important thing in the world? Before Billy Graham could answer, Adenauer jumped in and answered his own question. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the most important thing there is. If Jesus Christ is alive, then there is hope for the world. If Jesus Christ is in the grave, then I don't see the slightest glimmer of hope on the horizon. The Easter story declares the fact that Jesus Christ is alive. And because of that most fundamental fact, we can have hope. Jesus brought hope into this world through his willingness to profoundly serve us by dying on the cross with humility. And he offers that hope to us as individuals so that we can then begin to offer it within our communities, our countries, and yes, our global trading system too. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne, very much. Very interesting talk, and thanks for your insights on global trade and also your comments at the end about humility and the perfect example of humility, Jesus. There are a number of questions, so we'll get right to it, so we don't waste time. And first question: what are some practical trade-related initiatives that can be pursued to strengthen trade in this current climate?
I'm going to take this from a Canadian perspective, first and foremost, but I think these apply to really any country in the world. So first of all, on a very high level, going back to my initial point, it means countries have to commit to the global trading institutions that they've created, both on a WTO level, but also on a regional bilateral agreement as well. They created those trade agreements for a reason, and we've seen them work well. But I think it goes farther than just that. From a government perspective, it then means ensuring domestically that you put the policies in place that can allow businesses to take advantage of those trade agreements. Because remember what I said, trade agreements don't trade, governments don't trade, businesses trade. So you create the rules, and then you've got to put in place the policies that enable the businesses to use them. And so that's where, again, a government has to ensure that its policies across the board all fit together, that you don't have some going one way, which actually increase taxes, put more burdens in place for businesses, which then prevent them from actually doing what they need to do in global markets. You want to ensure that you are putting in policies to develop competitiveness, because that's why you created the trade agreements in the first place. That's what then can raise standards of living. That's what then can allow the goodwill to build between countries instead of seeing barriers go up. So that's government's role. So in a nutshell, governments have to remember what is their role, what can they do to help businesses succeed within the web of agreements they have already put in place. In certain cases, there may be gaps. New trade agreements are needed. But really, when you think about it from a Canadian perspective, we have an agreement with Europe, we have one in North America, we have many bilateral agreements in South America, we have a huge new agreement in Asia, and there may be some more tinkering that needs to happen, there may be a few more, but now it's really empowering businesses to capitalize on them. So then from a business perspective, well, then I think it's up to business now to get creative. How can I capitalize? What do I need to do, say, from an e-commerce perspective? What do I need to do to understand what those agreements are all about? They're going to government using things like trade commissioner services to actually understand how can I maximize the opportunities that are there. So, you could go down into any of those categories. I could go on and on, but I think in a global sense, that's what I would suggest.
And maybe a springboard to the next question, your comments that you just made, but when governments and businesses pursue their own interests. So Janet Yellen announced that the US would initiate efforts to encourage G20 countries to harmonize corporate tax rates to discourage businesses from operating in countries with lower tax rates. Would such a step help to address the challenges to global trade?
Well, again, higher taxes mean businesses are less competitive. It costs them more. It makes things more difficult. So I think this is one of these things I'm not going to say yes, I'm not going to say no, because again, that's each country has the freedom to put in place the policies that it thinks is best suited, and come election time, well, then it's up to people to decide if they agree. But really, if you are looking to maximize the opportunities that free trade offers, you want to bring down barriers. You want to maximize competitiveness. So yes, I can see in a sense, the thought is if you bring taxes up for everybody, well, now everybody's on a level playing field. But in the meantime, you are actually hurting businesses from doing what it's doing best, which is to compete. Really, you want to see that lowering. And so, a lot of people argue we need tougher environmental standards, we need more labor standards to raise this, to put everybody on an equal footing. For sure, some of that is necessary. And yet you want to enhance competitiveness. And so governments need to think, how are they going to do that best? And make sure that every policy they pursue is actually geared towards that.
Thanks, Ed. Switching continents, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement came into force on January 1st of this year, 2021. From your perspective, what do you think Canada should do to fast track the integration of Africa in a fair global economy?
Well, here I would go back to within the WTO framework, within that Doha development agenda, there was a lot of really good work that was being done. It is still there to ensure that developing countries can become more and more integrated into the global trading system. There are special treatment provisions for developing countries, for least developing countries. So that's the forum in which they can make the most difference. And so what does that require? It means countries from every continent going back to committing to, let's see what we can do to reform some of the problems facing that institution. On another level, Africa now has this free trade agreement within itself. How can African countries also create other agreements with, say, other regions, other countries, just like Canada has done, to actually advance the gains that they may secure in the WTO? That those are the strategies that Canada has always looked to. We are a country reliant on fair and rules-based trading conditions, and that has been the way that Canada has succeeded.
Thanks, Ed. We're going to switch continents again. And this next question, China is the second largest economy in the world. How can Canada balance its trade policy with China, taking into consideration the many issues of human rights, Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the maritime military incursions into the Indo-Pacific region? You knew probably that question was going to come up.
Yeah, and whoever has the answer to that question will be, that is sort of the $1 million question that people ask all the time. And certainly I cannot answer that $1 million question. I could give you my own 2 cents worth, but that is not an easy question to answer. And I've asked actually quite a few of my colleagues, quite a few people who have been involved in trade a lot longer than me, what is your answer to that question? And everybody, we all kind of say the same thing. I think the first place that you have to start is you have to recognize what a trade agreement is and what a trade agreement can do. And I mean, as great as these things are, they can't solve every problem. And so, we have to also remember that this is a very complicated relationship. And so we have to be careful not to assume trade with China is going to solve every one of the problems that we have with China. It can certainly help, can certainly build relationships. It can certainly help Canadians get the inputs that they need and get our goods into market. There's no question about it. And for many years, that actually worked relatively well under, obligations, and they're called most favored nations rules. I won't go into that within the WTO context, but it did work relatively well and just built those kinds of relationships. We can't turn a blind eye to the fact that much of what we need is sourced there. But we also cannot turn a blind eye that China has its own ambitions. And we can't just naively assume that it's the relationship with China is going to be like it is with other countries. We just simply can't do that. And we're seeing what happens if we do that. Barriers will go up. There are real human rights issues. There are real security issues. And so, we have to look at, can those be dealt with within existing trade agreements, within investment agreements that we have with them? And if not, where else can we look? And here, I think from a Canadian perspective, there is safety in numbers. So how do we work with allies? How do we use, for example, the 5 Eyes? How do we do that to ensure that our security interests are protected? What means do we have to protect our domestic producers from barriers that China will have to put in place? And for canola, for example, that could be encouraging canola producers to look for more diversified markets within, again, that web of agreements that we've created. It could be using trade rules to protect Canadian producers from unfairly priced and subsidized goods when they enter our border. And I did that all the time at the CITT. Most cases came back to goods from China, whether they were coming directly from China or in through another country. How could we ensure that protections were there? So that's my answer, which is really just a lot of thoughts. But again, that is a difficult question. And I think the simple answer is you have to stand up for the rights that we have, the obligations that we have. We have to work with other countries to ensure that those problems don't get out of hand.
Thanks, Anne. We have 1 minute left for our Q&A, and I'm sorry we haven't got to them all. We've got kind of the gist of most of them. But Anne, the last question, you referenced the need for and the difference that humility makes in family, national, and international settings. Would you briefly just give a personal example of seeing what difference it has made?
Personally, on a personal level, I think nothing teaches you humility more than being a wife and a mother, or a spouse and a mother. You realize pretty quickly that you don't have all the answers, that what you necessarily think is right is not necessarily right, and it's not all about you. And when you make a mistake, you have to say, I'm sorry. And I've certainly seen that on a personal level. As many of you, I can see you're smiling, so obviously you have too. The same is true on a professional level, though. Let me give you one brief thing which really underscored what humility can do in a working relationship. When I was at the CITT, I was tasked to decide a case that was worth a few $100 million. And I quite literally felt the weight of the world on my shoulder. I questioned, do I actually have what it takes to make that kind of decision? I knew the implications for the businesses involved, and I was not sleeping well. I was really struggling with it. And I looked to 2 of my law clerks for some input. That, after all, was their job. Their job was there to help and support. And unfortunately, they were not performing as they should have. And I got very, very, very angry and lost my temper. And I'm not proud of that. I went too far. I was stressed and I was very angry. Some of my colleagues heard what happened and came to me and said, well, you were perfectly justified to do what you did. It was their problem, not yours. You had every right to be angry. But it didn't sit well with me because I knew that was not the right way to act. And so I had to, with humility, go and ask for their forgiveness and say, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Not you. I was wrong. And this is my responsibility. And I need to help you ensure that you give me what I need from you instead of simply demanding from them. And the one I apologized to her had tears streaming down her face. And by this time, so did I. And she then apologized. She then admitted what was wrong. And humility transformed that relationship. It built respect. It built trust. It actually fostered a far more productive workplace and working relationship, far better decision, and it developed friendships. And that would not have happened if I hadn't said I was sorry. And so, yes, humility breaks down barriers and it allows people to work together.
Thank you very much, Anne, for your insightful responses to these questions, and Terry as well for fielding as many as you could in that time. The Honourable Ed Fast, former Minister of International Trade, will make concluding statements and offer thanks to NPAR.
Well, let me begin by thanking Dr. Penner for sharing her thoughts on trade with us. And you've provided all of us with an excellent primer on rules-based international trade and why it should be of importance to every single Canadian. Those of us who have spent any time in the pursuit of international trade know that once the trade bug has bitten you, you're never going to get rid of it. Or to plagiarize a famous Eagles tune, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. And I, for one, have never left that hotel and still have the trade bug in me. And I continue to be fascinated by how trade liberalization and the harnessing of comparative advantage have such incredible potential to promote global prosperity. Because when trade is done right, it has the potential to lift all ships. When trade is truly free and fair, it is not a zero-sum game where it's I win, you lose, or the other way around. Rather, it's about growing the economic pie around the world and helping to fight global poverty in regions of the world that have difficulty in participating in the global economy. But to be successful, those wanting to participate also need to come to a consensus on trade and follow the rules. And therein lies the problem. As Anne has so aptly described it, many of the world's nations have actually turned inward and have been swept up in a global tide of populism and protectionism, dramatically undermining the value of global rules-based trade. And as Anne has also noted, our greatest ally and largest trade partner to the South hasn't made it any easier, with former President Trump effectively emasculating the World Trade Organization by refusing to appoint individuals to properly adjudicate trade disputes. And not only has he done that, he's also placed tariffs on our steel and aluminum under the pretext of Canada being a national security threat to the US. Can you imagine that? What a step backwards in promoting our highly integrated North American supply chains. And we've also seen this with the large emerging economies like China and Brazil and India and Indonesia, the BRICS countries as they refer to. These countries have from time to time actively prevented the global community from achieving consensus on forward-leaning trade policies. And they've abused WTO rules in order to block our imports. And that's where countries like Canada have an opportunity to reassume the mantle of being champions of free trade within the global marketplace. And I say countries in plural, as there are others that share our view that trade liberalization represents a huge opportunity to improve economic outcomes for people all around the world. Countries like the UK and New Zealand and Australia and Singapore, they're all, to one degree or another, champions of free trade and are still anxious to re-engage and provide new leadership on the trade front. Canada is part of that group and has negotiated trade agreements with 51 different countries around the world. But these free trade agreements are only part of the story. What about the rest of the world, especially the developing and the least developed countries? How will they benefit from freer and fairer trade? That will take leadership at the multilateral level, at the WTO, at the OECD, and elsewhere, by champions of trade liberalization. That's why I'm excited about a new initiative called CANZUK, which would see Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, CANZUK, form a geopolitical alliance that would allow our four countries to speak with one voice on issues such as foreign policy, on defense and global security, on trade and investment policy within an increasingly bipolar world. And by bipolar, I mean the US and China being the two superpowers that now joust for power and contend for power. So as you will have noticed, I am still enthralled to the incredible possibilities offered by rules-based global trade. And I sense that Anne is as well. So thank you for your thoughtful presentation, Anne. And a very special thank you to you for highlighting the Easter message of humility and the sacrificial servant leadership of the resurrected Jesus and the message of the cross and the empty grave that we've just celebrated. I share your confidence and faith in a risen Jesus Christ as the most transformational and life-changing proposition ever offered to the human race. I refer to the three solas, as they're called: by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. So again, and thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and your insight with us today. And now I'll turn it back over to Darlene.
But thank you, Ed, for your presence and participation with us today. We appreciate that. We know you're between meetings. We're grateful for your sacrificial service to Canada and Canadians in your many roles over the years. We're grateful for your wisdom and your humble mindset, as well as that of our program participants, Ann Penner and Terry Wills. And so we, as the Christian Embassy team, want to thank you for your participation today as well. We are committed to supporting and inspiring you in your leadership roles. For other inspirational messages and resources from prior speakers, you can consult our website, christianembassy.ca, particularly under the resource tab. We will continue to inspire and connect you with other leaders like we have done today. And again, a huge thank you to each and every one. The challenge that we received today was great. We all want to grow in that mindset of humility, and that you spoke to us about. Thank you for that challenge and for sharing the truths of how that is possible. And so I just want to say to each and every one, God bless you and the work of your hands. Take care.